So now I'd like to introduce Donovan Preza. He is a PhD student in geography at Manoa. Both his MA and BA are in geography. Donovan is an instructor in Hawaiian studies at Kapiolani Community College. His research and lifelong passion has focused on the Mahele of 1848 and Hawaiian land tenure. His MA research argued that the Mahele, contrary to popular belief, helped to secure Hawaiian rights in land and that the overthrow of the Hawaiian government was a larger causal factor for Hawaiian land loss. I give you Donovan Preza.
Aloha, Bob, for that introduction. Aloha kako to everyone out there. First off, mahalo for having me on Laku ʻokoʻa. Glad that I get to be part of this genealogy, part of this chain of sharing. And so mahalo to everyone out there who's spending their Saturday Laku ʻokoʻa having a listen. Title of my presentation today is Naboth's Vineyard, the Crown Lands Transmutation from Private to Public Property. And the topic for today is the Crown Lands. And on Laku ʻokoʻa, I wanted to give some context or a couple of main points for this presentation. First, Laku ʻokoʻa was the day that secured Hawaiian sovereignty and also, in a way, secured Hawaiian governance. And with that securing of Hawaiian governance, we had our voice secured, right? Like we were the ones making the laws, and it was our culture and our custom and our laws that were getting passed during the Hawaiian Kingdom time. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind with Laku ʻokoʻa today, is not only did we get sovereignty secured, but we got governance secured and recognition of that Hawaiian Kingdom government. And with that recognition of that government, we were in control, we were in charge, we were the lawmakers, right? We were the law interpreters. And that's going to be a huge thing, as we're going to find out, because in 1893, we lost control of that governance, right? So first point, Laku ʻokoʻa, securing governance, gave us a voice, right? Gave the Hawaiian people a voice. Second point I'd like to pay attention to is, if you want to fix a problem, you have to properly diagnose that problem, right? You cannot, if I have a sprained ankle and I take Dimetap, it's not going to do much for my sprained ankle. So if you want to fix a problem, you have to properly diagnose that problem, right? So all around us is this problem today with land. And that genealogy, that story, that mo'olelo goes back to the Mahele. And understanding the Mahele, and oftentimes people will shift the focus and take the focus off the overthrow and put it on the Mahele. And the argument is that this reality we see today with land is a result of the Mahele. What I'd like you guys to take from this today is the result, in my estimation, the problem with land today is more attributable to our loss of governance, our loss of voice in making law, in interpreting law, and so on. And because these are really two alternative stories. In one story, it's our ali'i's fault, right? It's if the Mahele is to blame, then I see many people using the argument that, well, it was the ali'i who sold the land, or it was the ali'i who did this, or it was the Mahele. And it was really the loss of governance. And the Crown Lands, which makes up for 25% of all of Hawaii, is one of the largest examples of that, right? Start off this talk with a metaphor. The Mahele is like Iolani Palace, right? So if you close your eyes and you take a look and you look at Iolani Palace from the outside, looks like a very European kind of thing, right? And this is where that identity metaphor of where you're a certain color skin on the outside and you're white on the inside, right? Basically saying that you have assimilated into Western culture. that you have become colonized or you have become Western, you have assimilated into, you're white on the inside, right? And we see this with coconut, brown on the outside, white on the inside. We see this with Oreo. We see this with Apple, right? All of these derogatory identity terms to say you have assimilated and you have become more white. Iolani Palace for me reverses and hoolies that metaphor, right? Now you're white, quote unquote, European on the outside, but all of the things on the inside, all of your na'au, all of your guts, right? The koa floors on the interior, the kukui motifs, the kalo motifs in the architecture, in all of the Hawaiian symbology on the inside, right? Inside we know who we are, outside we need to appease and do this palace thing, this international relations theme, right? But it's a huli of that metaphor. We know who we are, right? And that for me is Hawaii's transition to private property. On the outside, it's fee simple, it's private ownership. On the inside, the guts, it's internals, right? Nowhere else in America do they have subject to the rights of native tenants, right? That is a distinctly Hawaiian thing. And that Hawaiian thing is because of La'ku ʻokoʻa, because of that securing of Hawaiian governance, that securing of our voice in governance and securing of sovereignty. Hawaii's political history, very, very, very different than other indigenous peoples. Not better, just different, right? And we need to observe and pay attention to those differences because it affects the filter with which through you interpret our history, right? And ultimately our identity. For me, the Mahele starts with the 1839 Declaration of Rights and 1840 Constitution, right? And I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. What does Mahele mean, right? Mahele means to divide. Follow-up question is what's being divided, right? And the common answer is usually the land. And for this presentation, the perspective I'd like you guys to take is the Mahele was a division of rights in land. And as a result of rights, people having rights acknowledged, people got land, right? To understand the Mahele as a division of land is to put the cart before the horse, so to speak, right? Hawaiian rights to land were acknowledged in the 1839 Declaration of Rights and 1840 Constitution. As a result of that, people got land. And that's where we get terms like the government land, crown lands, and kuleana lands, right? So who has rights in land? Well, traditionally speaking, it was the native tenants, and the chiefs, right? And this all gets brought forth and pulled into the 1840 Constitution, right? This is where custom gets codified into law. And that phenomenon right there is huge, right? Other indigenous peoples are arguing to have their custom recognized in American law. In Hawaiian Kingdom law, our custom was brought in and was transitioned into made law, right? So we're ahead of the curve, so to speak. And all of that, again, is tied back to La'ku ʻokoʻa and recognition of governance, and the fact that we were in charge of our governance, right? The origin of the present government and system of polity is as follows. Kamehameha I was the founder of the kingdom, and to him belonged all the land, right? And this is where this word land has multiple meanings. Land, sovereignty of a country, land, real estate, right? And to him belonged all the land, sovereignty of a country, Kana'iau Puni. Kamehameha the Great is the person who strung all of the 4 island kingdoms together and unified those islands from one end of the islands to the other, though it was not his own private property. And there we get the distinction between land and real estate, right? If you own a house, you still own your house subject to the sovereignty of the state. You pay property tax, you follow zoning laws, and so on and so forth, right? So big umbrella, sovereignty of the country. Within that sovereignty resides the real estate, the real property, right? Kapihe has a quote, one of the prophets around Kamehameha's time, and he basically said, that which is above will fall and that which is below will rise. For me, this is a manifestation of that prophecy. This is where the Maka'ainana class, the native tenants, were given personal and real property rights for the first time ever, right? Never before did the Maka'ainana class have rights in real property, and never before were their rights to personal property uh, preserved. Prior to, in traditional times, a chief, a konohiki, could come and confiscate your personal property. If you were uh, a bird catcher, you, the products of your hands, all of those feathers were up for quote unquote confiscation, right? So the 1840 Constitution is huge in securing rights for the native tenants, right? Few years later, we get the Principles of the Land Commission. It being therefore fully established, there are but three classes of persons having vested rights in the land. First, the government, second, the landlord, and third, the tenant. It next becomes necessary to ascertain the proportional rights of each, right? In 1840, we get the Constitution, which starts to divide out what was once in the king himself. That concept of the separation of the powers of the king gets pulled out, and that's where we get this concept of government, right? Landlords, that's your konehiki, that's your chiefly class. Native tenants, that's your makai nana, right? So very, very, very important here, the 1839 Declaration of Rights, 1840 Constitution, rights are secured to the people in law in the Constitution. Kuykendall makes reference to this, right? We find in 1840 the first admission by the king and chiefs that the common people had an actual ownership interest as distinguished from a mere right of use. That's huge. If you're familiar with the bundle of sticks metaphor, what he's saying is the bundle is yours, not just the one stick that says you can use it, not just the one stick that says you can go and gather, right? You have the whole bundle. The common people had an actual ownership interest. There are but three classes having vested rights in land. First, the government, second, the chiefs, third, the native tenants, right? That's where all of this stuff gets codified, and that's the genealogy, the beginning of the genealogy of that concept and that idea in law, right? So, who has rights in land? Well, we just learned from the Constitution that first the government, second the chiefs, third the native tenants, right? The 1840 Constitution says these three entities owned land, right? In a different presentation, I talk about how we have to start taking ownership of ownership, right? If you ask Hawaiians today, did Hawaiians own land? Many Hawaiians will say no, right? And for me, if you're going to give away the concept of ownership, you're giving away a whole bunch of things that we then have to go fight back for, right? The 1839 Declaration of Rights says you owned it. Why are we giving that away, right? So that's its own presentation, but I want to kind of put that out there and let that one stick for a little bit for people. The 1840 Constitution says we owned it, right? Why would we deny that? So we're going to do a brief overview of the results of the Mahele. And so before, just to general overview to introduce us to the concept of crown lands, right? So the Mahele event happens on between January 27th and March 7th of 1848. On that day, Kauikeoli, acting as a chief, the highest ranking chief, not acting as representative of government, with the other 252 chiefs, they divide their interests in all of Hawaii, and and they divide out their interests, right? Kauikeoli gets 2.5 million acres. The 252 Konehiki receive 1.5 million acres. In this concept, we still have the rights of government and the rights of native tenants in the orange and also in the peach color, right? But the chiefs, the chiefly class, the Konehikis, have divided out their interests. The day after the Mahele, Kauikeoli takes his 2.5 million acres and divides it between himself, representative of government, and himself, the chief. And this is where we get our king's lands and our government lands, right? Government lands are similar in concept to the White House. When the next president of the United States comes into the White House, or the national parks, right? They get use and control of government public property. The king's lands, that would be Trump Plaza. That's private property, right? So this is that distinction between public and private property. King's lands being private property, Donald Trump's Trump Tower, Trump Plaza, the real estate he owns, the government lands being the public lands, being the White House, right? And this is the distinction that gets blurred after the overthrow. After the overthrow, this distinction between public and private property get blurred. And what the sugar guys do is basically confiscate the Trump Plaza and say that it belongs to the United States of America, right? And this is the significance of understanding this story, right? The story of the Crown Lands. 252 Konehikis. After 1855, they participate with commutation. They give back, they exchange some lands, give some lands back to the government, and end up keeping their lands in fee simple, right? I'm going to gloss over these parts because what we want to get to today is the story of the Crown Lands, right? This isn't a Mahele overview, it's the story of the Crown Lands. And this leaves us with our familiar King's lands, government lands, Konehiki lands. Konehiki lands, those are our Ali'i Trust, Queen Liliuokalani, Queen's Hospital, Kamehameha Schools, Lunalilo Estate, right? All of that coming from the Konehiki lands. The Kuleana lands that strip in the white, that's from the 1850 Kuleana Act. The King's lands, private property of the king, and the government lands, public property. Right? And that's the rough approximate breakdowns around 1855. So as a result of dividing out the interests of the government, we get government lands. Divide out the rights of the Konehiki, you get Konehiki lands and King's lands. Later, the King's lands, later known as the Crown lands. And as a result of dividing out the rights of the native tenants, you get the Kuleana lands. Right? So government land, Konehiki land, Kuleana land, all of these correspond to that concept of there are but three classes having rights in land. First, the government, second, the chiefs, third, the native tenants. When each of those rights were divided, we created this big corpus of original title. Government land, Konehiki land, and Kuleana land, right? An important distinction because there you see the king's land being compartmentalized in the Konehiki land, because it was the private property of Kauikeoli, not the White House. If it were conceptually considered the White House, it would be in the green under government, right? And that's the important distinction because, again, that's the distinction that's going to be blurred come 1893. So if we foreshadow and kind of take a look at what happens to these lands between 1846 and 1893, you have approximately 667,000 acres of government land sold before 1893. You have about 100,000 acres of Kamehameha deeds, sales from the king's land sold, right? And this is where you need to understand the mo'olelo of the genealogy of the crown lands, right? Between 1848 and 1864 and 65, those lands were available for sale. When Kamehameha V, Lot Kapuaiwa, comes in, he asked the legislature to make those lands inalienable. Inalienable means unavailable for sale. So between 1865 and 1893, you have the Crown Land Commission on Leases established. So between 1865 and 1893, Crown lands are leased almost in their entirety to sugar, right? Sugar is not really buying in that red section you see there. The entity, the economy that is driving the purchase of that red section is cattle, right? Paniolo. That's all of your ranches. That's um, Kahuku Ranch on the Big Island, 100 in South Point, Big Island, 167,000 acres. Parker Ranch, 28,000 acres. Um, and Island of Niihau for ranching originally, right? That's all of those purchase. Ranching is buying the red. And I'm not saying Sugar did not buy any land. I'm saying they weren't the dominant purchasers of that red portion of the pie. Sugar, in its entirety, leases almost in its near entirety, leases the entirety of the Crown lands. That 900,000 acres is leased by Sugar. And you have to understand that Paniolo or ranching cattle is the dominant economy till the 1870s or 1880s. It's not until after the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania in 1870 that whaling goes down. And whaling was driving cattle because the whaling ships needed provisions that would last out at sea when they're going to the Aleutian Islands for 2, 3, 4 months at a time, right? So that story right there of the Crown lands being leased in entirety by the Sugar, and also in 1865, those Crown lands are made inalienable. So Sugar would not be able to buy or purchase the leases that they have between 1865, after 1865. They're not allowed to purchase those lands. They're by law inalienable. This is the importance of laku ʻokoʻa, securing sovereignty and securing governance. When you're in charge of governance and you're making the laws, these kinds of things happen, right? You can protect the things that need protection. And at that time, Lot Kapuaiva sought protection for the Crown lands because he did not want to see them purchased anymore. So this then extends out to the deeds or the instruments of title that people use, the royal patent grants, land patent grants, Kamehameha deeds, land patent grants, land commission award, Konehiki awards, land commission awards, Kuleana awards. These are the actual deeds that correspond to each of these conceptual categories of Kuleana lands, Konehiki lands, and government lands. If you do research or land title research, then you're going to be looking at a royal patent grant or a land patent grant or a Kamehameha deed, right? And if you conceptually understand this slide right here, then you'll know where to go look for things, right? Okay, is the land I'm on government land? Is it Konehiki land? Is it a Kuleana award, right? And understanding the genealogy will then point you to the archive or repository much faster. So it's really, really important. For me, this is the first thing I teach. Before I teach students, oh, go look here for this or go look there for that, I really think you need to understand this one slide right here. If you can explain every term on this page, then you're in a good spot. So right now, we have, or moving on to the Crown lands and the story of the Crown lands. What did the Constitution say about the Crown lands? Well, the 1840 Constitution, under prerogatives of the King, he also shall retain his own private lands, and lands forfeited for the non-payment of taxes shall revert to him, right? This is where I'd like you to pay close attention to the language that is used. He also shall retain his own private lands. Not he shall retain his public lands, he shall retain his private lands, right? Private lands are Trump Plaza. Public lands are the White House, right? Article 41 of the 1852 Constitution, the King's private lands and other property are inviolable. Article 39, 1864, the King's private lands and other property are inviolable, right? This is the significance of laku ʻokoʻa. You secure your sovereignty, you secure your governance, you're the one writing the Constitution. You're the one codifying law. What did they choose to protect? What is one of the things they chose to protect? Well, Article 39 protects the private lands of the king. right? Not only protects them, but says they are inviolable. What does the 1887 Constitution say? This is the first constitution that's not written by our ali'i. Article 39, removed, right? So the 1887 Constitution removes Article 39 in its entirety, and the king's private lands and other property are no longer inviolable. They are no longer protected by the Constitution, right? This goes back to the importance of laku ʻokoʻa, goes back to the importance of having a voice in governance. When you lose that voice in governance, you lose your ability to protect these kinds of things, right? So we're going to see how this plays out a little later. One of the important things to understand is why the mahele was needed, right? If you know what, one of the things I'm an instructor at Kapiolani Community College, and one of the things I always talk to my students is about being able to ask and answer the right question, right? If you can ask the right question, then you'll figure out the solution, right? And so this is the question for the mahele is, why did we need a mahele, right? And the king talks about this in Privy Council. And this is just one of the many reasons, right? Today I'm talking about the Crown Lands, so I'm emphasizing this one. By no means am I saying that there aren't other causes, but this is the cause that is important to the Crown Lands. This is also the cause that gets ignored or minimized or backgrounded, right? So all I'm trying to do here is to bring this back into the foreground and take it out of the background, to shine some light back on this, because it's the story of 25% of Hawaii's land, right? The records of the discussion in Privy Council show plainly His Majesty's anxious desire to free his lands from the burden of being considered public domain. That's that public-private distinction. White House, Trump Plaza. And as such, subjected to the danger of confiscation in the event of his islands being seized by any foreign power. Due to gunboat diplomacy, due to colonialism, imperialism, Kamehameha III and the ali'i at that time understood how power was played. If a foreign power came into Hawaii and took over Hawaii in 1830, then all 4.2 million acres of Hawaii would have gone to that foreign power, right? Why? Because private property is respected, but public property is up for confiscation in the event of seizure by a foreign power, right? So here we see Kamehameha III's intention was to have his private lands considered private property, not public, right? His intention, one of his reasons for creating private property in the first place was if a foreign power came to Hawaii, not all of the lands would be confiscated, right? Imagine Great Britain takes over Hawaii in 1840, and now you got to go ask King George, hey, King George, can I have some land, please? Right? If we had private property, then King George would have respected that private property had Great Britain taken us over, right? So this is the importance, this is the significance, this is the international relations, right? This is Kamehameha III is no longer threatened by a Hawaii island chief, he's now threatened by a British island chief, right? He's now threatened by a continental chief and a chief of America and a chief from these foreign lands, right? The way to maintain pono had shifted, changed. The threat was no longer domestic within Hawaii. Now the threats were international. In Privy Council, they cite these different authorities, and they had these books, and they were reading these books, commentaries on the laws of England, commentaries on American law, right? James Kent. Kent writes, the general usage now is not to touch private property upon land without making compensation. right? If you want to build rail, if the government wants to build rail, they can't just take someone's private property. They have to offer just compensation, right? That's the eminent domain part of it, right? And again, paying attention to language. The general usage now is not to touch private property. If a foreign power should take the islands, what lands would they respect? William Little Lee gave it as his opinion that any foreign power would respect the king's private lands, right? The king's right to his private lands would be respected, public property would be confiscated. So for Kamehameha III, there was a huge desire to make a public-private distinction, because if all the lands belonged to him in a public capacity as absolute monarch, they would all be eligible for confiscation in the event of conquest. And we had multiple threats for this. We had the French in 1839. We had Britain in 1843 with the story of La Ho'iho'i'a, right? So there were very real, incredible threats that Kamehameha III was facing. So he had the choice. Create private property or take the chance and leave it and see what happens when your country gets taken over. The king said, unless it were so, he would prefer having no lands whatsoever. The king observed that he would prefer that his private land should be registered not in a separate book, but in the same book as all other allodial titles, all other fee simple titles, and that the only separate book should be that of the government lands. So here you see that public-private distinction. I want my lands with all the private property. The only separate book should be the government property, the public property. We're trying to make a distinction between public and private. Right? So here we see his intention here was private. Right? And this was that distinction that was made between January 27th and March 7th. All of this was written and codified in the Mahele book, which you can Google Hawaii State Archives Mahele book, and you can get a digital copy of this, of that transaction. On the left-hand side of the page, Kamehameha III, right-hand side of the page, one of the 252 chiefs with their name of the land, whether it's in Ahupua'a, what kalana it's in, and what island it's on, right? Ahupua'a District Island, right? Hawaii transitions to private property without maps. The Mahele book is the evidence of that, right? We don't have a huge systematic mapping project until the 1870 Hawaii Government Survey is created. That's why we have such problems today, because we don't have a land identification system. The TMK, the tax map key, is not a land identification system. It does not identify each piece of land separately and individually, right? This is why place names in Hawaii are so important. If you erase a place name off of a map, off of a TMK map, off of a road sign, you just lost 500 acres if people forget the name of that place, right? Place names are not only important culturally, place names are also important as a matter of land title, due to the fact that it was a list of place names in a book that was codified. You erase one of those place names and all of a sudden somebody loses land, right? So as an aside, any threat to place names, I would take very, very, very seriously because of the ramifications for land title. The day after the Mahele, there are two separate instruments that are signed, right? Kauikeoli signs one instrument, which reads, "For me and for my heirs and successors forever." This is going to be the clause that becomes the interpretation for a court case in 1864. This essentially creates the king's lands, what is later known as the crown lands. This is the private property of the king. The second instrument that is signed creates the government lands. I do hereby give, make over, and set apart forever to my chiefs and people of my kingdom, and convey all right, title, and interest to the land situated on pages 179 to 225, to have and to hold to my chiefs and people forever. Right? This is the government lands. Right? So in this separation of two separate instruments, instrument one, here's my private property. Instrument two, here's the government property. Instrument one, Trump Tower. Instrument two, the White House, national parks. Right? So here we see another clear and deliberate path trying to make a distinction between public and private. Right? Legislature on June 7th, 1848 acknowledges this, expressing our deepest thanks to His Majesty for this noble and truly royal gift, ... to be the private lands of His Majesty Kamehameha III. So the legislature understands the king's lands to be the private property, not the public property of Kamehameha III. Right? These belong to the chief. These do not belong to the government. And that's that separation. Before 1840, government and the king were one and the same. After 1840, those things began to separate, and you got the creation of the executive department, you got the creation of the legislative department, you got the creation of the judicial department. What was once the king's kuleana now got outsourced to these separate departments, right? But here you clearly see private lands of His Majesty. And this is where we get the king's lands and the government lands. King's lands, private; government lands, public. King's lands, Trump Plaza; government lands, the White House. (1865) rolls around. Kamehameha IV, Liho passes away, leaving his widow, Queen Emma. And he passes away unexpectedly after the death of his son at the age of 4, the young prince. And Kamehameha IV dies without a will. As a result of him dying without a will, they had to figure out what happened to his estate, what happened to his property, right? And we have a court case in regard to the estate of Kamehameha IV, Volume 2, page 715. First, we need some background on inheritance laws, right? What are the inheritance laws? If we check the Civil Code, Section 1447, whenever any person shall die intestate, without a will, within this kingdom, his property, both real and personal, of every kind and description, shall descend to and be divided among his heirs as hereinafter prescribed. Section 1448 says it goes to the intestate's children. Kamehameha IV and Emma did have a child, but that child died at the age of 4, so no living children. Second point says it goes to the children's children. None there, right? The prince was only 4 years old when he passed, which then means, if no issue, half to the widow and half to his father and mother, right? So by Kamehameha IV dying without a will, following the laws of the Hawaiian kingdom, which are in the Civil Code, half would have went to the widow, the other half to his father and mother, right? Lot Kapuaiwa would have inherited nothing. Right? I'm going to skip over dower just because of my 20-minute delay here. So Kamehameha V's argument is that the crown lands are basically government property, an appanage of the crown. They are connected to the crown. In the way the White House is connected to the presidency of the United States, Kamehameha V is arguing this is government property, royal domain annexed to, connected to the crown. The result of that would be that it's not subject to dower and not subject to inheritance law. Right? Queen Emma makes the opposite argument. She says this is private property, distributable according to the law of private property. Under her argument, as private property, these lands would be subject to dower and would be subject to inheritance law, right? So they're basically making the exact opposite argument. And I actually really appreciate the fact that we have this court case, because now there's no guessing. We don't have to guess 150 years later what the intention of these people were. We have a Hawaiian Kingdom court case in 1864, which gave us a ruling, right? The positives, and by positive I don't mean good value judgment good. By positive I mean consistent with what we've seen, right? So the positive coming from Kamehameha V's argument is the successors to the crown would inherit. The inconsistency would be it's considered government property. Everything we've seen to this point said it's public property, not private it's private property, not public property, right? Because government property gets confiscated in the event of conquest. Queen Emma, the significance of hers is we maintain that private property aspect. The inconsistency is these are no longer crown lands, nothing left for the successors. Kamehameha V would inherit nothing according to the intestate laws, right? So here you see the dilemma. On the one hand, it's private property. On the other hand, nothing gets inherited by the successors to the throne, right? And that's where that clause, for me and for my heirs and successors forever. And what does that clause mean? In that instrument in the Mahele book that separated the kings and government lands, for me and my heirs and successors forever. What does that clause mean? Before we get to the decision, some additional evidence of private property. Kamehameha III sold these lands as Kamehameha deeds. They did not take the form of a government template. They did not take the form of royal patent grants. Kamehameha III's will acknowledges Kalama's right to dower, right? You only have dower in private property. There is no dower in government property. Kamehameha IV also acknowledged Kalama's right to dower and paid money to her in lieu of her dower. Kamehameha IV also sold lands through Kamehameha deeds. Kamehameha deeds you can find at the Bureau of Conveyance. The entities that are required to file at the Bureau of Conveyance are all private individuals, right? The government of Hawaii is not filing deeds and land sales at the Bureau of Conveyance. That's where private individuals file. So here you see further evidence that Kamehameha III, Kamehameha IV, and Queen Emma all considered these lands private property, right? They're not selling them as royal patent grants, which is how government lands are being sold. They're selling them as private deeds registered at the Bureau of Conveyance, where private individuals register land sales. To Hawaii 715, here's the verdict of the court case. Under that act, the lands descend in fee, the inheritance being limited, however, to successors to the thrones as private property, right? So here we have a couple of things going on. As private property, not public property, private property, right? So this is the private property of Kamehameha III. This is Trump Tower. This isn't the White House. The inheritance of those lands being limited, however, to successors to the throne, right? The concept of fee simple plays in here. Fee simple means that you own a piece of land and the inheritance is not limited. The simple, that word simple means inheritance not limited. Inheritance is generally distributed to anyone, to whoever. The opposing concept or a limitation on inheritance is called a fee tail. A fee tail comes from Britain and is a vestige of those days when in the British system, they would inherit lands would be inherited by their eldest son. Not my first daughter, not my second daughter, not my second son, not my third son. my eldest son. That limitation on inheritance, that limitation to a specific inheritor, is called a tail. Fee tails do not exist in American property law for the most part. They do exist in British common law. They do not exist in American common law, right? And this is where law ʻokoʻa in 1848 comes in. Hawaii is an independent country. It had laws and it borrowed laws from other countries, but it had a legal system unique and unto itself. And you need to understand that and not just assume that because America is our occupier today, that our legal system was American, or because the 1820 missionaries are from America, that we inherited their American legal system, right? We were our own country and we had our own legal system that borrowed from many, many, many different places. But that's the subject of a whole nother presentation. Right? So what the judge basically said is this is private property, the inheritance being limited to successors to the crown. Right? So for me, this is brilliant in maintaining consistency with things we've seen all along. Right? Kamehameha III intended for these lands to go to the next king, successors to the crown. Kamehameha IV inherited all of these lands, right? Kamehameha III had a will, and in that will, he gifted these lands to Kamehameha IV, right? He didn't distribute them to all of his heirs generally at the time. He took this 1,000,000 acres of land and gave them to Kamehameha IV, right? And so for me, this 1864 court case really respects the purpose and intent. And it's a really, 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 really interesting court case for that way, right? So for me and for my heirs and successors forever, this was interpreted by this court case to mean my heirs and successors to the crown, but as private property. It's not an appanage of the crown. It's not connected to the crown. It's inherited by whoever becomes, right? So this is how it goes from Lunalilo to outside the Kamehameha line to Kalakaua, and from Kalakaua to Liliuokalani. The entity that inherited the crown inherited this 900,000 acres of land. All right. So now 1894 Constitution, and Kale, I only have about 5 more minutes. So I'm almost pa. I know I'm into the question and answer time. 1894 Constitution, Article 95. Pay attention to the language, because it's that slippery slope of language, that changing of words and terminologies is where 25% of Hawaii gets taken. That portion of the public domain, and there you see the word public, not private, right? Heretofore known as the Crown Lands, is hereby declared to have been and now to be the property of the Hawaiian government. I hereby declare everyone listening on Facebook Live, all of your houses, I hereby declare belong to me. All of your cars belong to me. I hereby declare, through this declaration, I have just taken ownership of all of your properties. So please mail me your keys and your deeds and titles. This is what Article 95 just said. That portion of the public domain heretofore known as the Crown Land is hereby declared to have been and now to be the property of the Hawaiian government. Right? If you skip down a little bit further, it shall be subject to alienation and other uses as may be provided by law. Right? So not only did they, by declaration, confiscate 25% of Hawaii, they also now made that 25% of Hawaii available for sale. Who's leasing these lands? Sugar. Sugar now wants to buy these lands. What do we need to do? Overthrow the government in 1893, write a new constitution, and in that constitution, confiscate the Crown Lands And after confiscating those crown lands, also make them available for sale. And this is when you see the transfer of lands to sugar. After the overthrow, after the 1893 overthrow, after the 1894 Constitution, after the 1895 Land Act. After we lost our voice in governance, after our government was overthrown, this is when the land reality was created that we see today. Right? Sugar's not buying these lands in 1870 and 1880. Our ali'i did not sell these lands to Sugar in 1870 and 1880. Sugar had to overthrow the country, overthrow the not the country, overthrow the government to gain control of the law creation ability, and after that make their own law, which then confiscated. Right? Article 12 or 13 of this same constitution says that you can't take private property for public uses without compensation. This is a violation of its own constitution. If this constitution is valid, right? I'm not, that's a whole nother story. But if, for the sake of argument, we acknowledge this constitution as lawfully, it violates its own article, Article 12, right? How does it violate it? By changing the word private domain to public domain. That portion of the public domain. Kamehameha III's lands were never the public domain. His whole purpose and intent was to eliminate that. I want to make sure my lands are considered private property because private property is confiscated in the event of conquest. Right? So if we look at the constitutions, King's private lands, inviolable. King's private lands, inviolable. 1887, they remove. So now now it's no longer unconstitutional to violate the crown, the king's lands. And in 1895, they declared the king's private property to be public property. By renaming, by changing one word from public to private, they confiscated 25% of Hawaii and then began to sell it to themselves. Right? That's how 25% of Hawaii, that's how the crown lands were taken. That's how Sugar got their lands. Right? Lili'u brings this up in 1910, brings a court under the U.S. Supreme Court. Although the court sustained the right of dower in the widow of the king, it is clear from the opinion from 1864 that the crown lands are treated as... Right, let's go back. This is the 1864 court case as private property, the inheritance being limited to successors to the throne. Although the court sustained the right of dower, it is clear from the opinion that the crown lands are treated not as the king's private property in the strict sense of the word. They belonged to the office and not to the individual, right? And here you see the craft with language. That which was public became private. That which was inherited by the office now belonged to the office, right? So it's all of these slight little shifts in wording. Public, private becomes public. Inherited by the office becomes belonged to the office. And this is how 25% of Hawaii gets taken, right? This is the importance of language. In language, there is life. In language, there is death. Right? This is how the crown lands were taken, right? And this is the significance of La Kuokoa. This would not have happened without the overthrow of governance, right? November 28th, 1843, Hawaii's sovereignty is recognized and Hawaii's government is recognized. We had a voice, right? 1893 took that voice away. And for those of you interested, there's an article, December 23rd, 1994, where Judge Emeritus Samuel P. King basically lays out for the people. He basically says, let me read. In the course of rewriting history and correcting past wrongs, as the start, it would not be unjust for the state of Hawaii to transfer whatever is left of the crown lands. Why would someone say you can give back the crown lands? Well,
probably because he understands the state of Hawaii doesn't have clear title to the crown land. So why not, if we're going to give anything back, why not we give back the stolen property? Because one day they're going to figure it out, right? This has nothing to do with sovereignty. This has nothing to do with joint resolution, no treaty, none of that stuff, right? This is just land title. This is just a matter of land, private property was taken for public use without compensation in 1894 and 1895, right?